The views of this program are not necessarily the views of KJLL Radio, its management, or its sponsors. The host is solely responsible for its content. Enjoy.
On a mission given to me by Woody Shaw, Sunship, Dizzy, and Billy Higgins, dedicated to pursuing a piece of our cultural heritage through interviews with my jazz heroes, this is The Jake Feinberg Show. Welcome, everybody, inside the studios of KJLL 1330 The Jolt. This is The Jake Feinberg Show, and today, very special guest. He's someone who's always believed in securing and investing in the creative arts. He understood as a young journalist in New York that in order to do this, you needed a devotion to the music and an understanding of the people behind the music. Not just the leaders, but the accompanists as well. After all, that's what jazz is about. My guest has spent the better part of the last half-century writing, promoting, and elucidating the public about the transitional periods of jazz, writing liner notes, and books. He is co-author with Leonard Feather of the biographical Encyclopedia of Jazz, and author of Jazz Masters of the 40s and Swing to Bop. He's also an avid sports fan and a big hockey player. It's a pleasure to welcome Ira Gitler to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Is everything, Jake?
Nice to talk to you, my friend.
Yeah, same here.
I just wanted to ask you, I treasure my collection of LPs. One of the largest segments of my collection is the Prestige label. Charles Kennard, Pat Martino, Eric Klaas, Bernard Purdy. Could you talk to the audience about the conception of Prestige Records and the leaders behind its cultivation?
Well, it comes out of Bob Weinstock, who was a young man back in the day, who was a record collector and a jazz fan, and got into trading 78s and also selling 78s out of his parents' apartment. And being someone who loved the music, he was on the scene in New York, which was quite a scene. It still is, but unbelievable in those days, where the people you could hear. And this grew, I guess, incrementally from the time I met him to deciding to have his own record label.
When you first came back to New York, you were it was hard to break in to the jazz industry, and did you spend a lot of time? You spent a lot of time in the back rooms, sorting records, going through them, cleaning, sweeping floors. Is that true?
Yeah, that was my first job with Prestige Records. At that time, it was called New Jazz, and later he brought in the Prestige label, which eventually and fairly quickly took over from New Jazz, although he kept New Jazz running as well. But then Prestige became his major label.
And in the 1950s, who were the major artists that you were involved with, that you were writing liner notes about for Prestige?
Well, there was Stan Getz and Lee Konitz. Trying to think of
I need to talk to you about the Zoot Sims 10-inch that you wrote about, the first one that you did.
That was the first time we put notes on the back of a 10-inch LP. Up till then, it was, just blank back covers. Then there was listing the catalog to date. The ones that were out, and then in those days, and I think in many cases of cataloging, you have different series, and the 10-inch LP were the was the 100 series, and when the 117th LP was to come out, that was the Zoot Sims. So that was the first time there was annotation and not advertising.
When you say advertising, you mean like a corporate, like sponsors on the back,
No, if Lee Konitz with Lenny Tristano did the first New Jazz, and so that was probably 100 or 101. I don't know, I can't remember exactly how they did it. But then 102 would advertise previous releases on the New Jazz label, and with the list of the tunes and the sidemen and the leader. And as that grew, the catalog, it took up more of the back of the 10-inch LP. Just telling people what was in the Prestige catalog.
It might seem obvious to you or myself, but I'm astounded at the amount of information that is given, the time that was taken to write these liner notes by yourself or guys like Dan Morgenstern, and it was something about knowledge, Ira. It was something about giving people information, the power of giving information, whether it was the accompanists or a side story about Pat Martino meeting Les Paul, or the fact that Charles Kennard worked with mentally retarded children. These were incredible stories. And I find that liner notes, as Bob Thiel used to say, these records represent newspapers of the time, and they can keep going on for many, many years.
Yeah, well, one time somebody said to me, "Oh, you write blurbs." And I said, "These are not blurbs. If I am trying to interest you in an album, it's not because I work for this company and I have to say good things about everybody. I am just, telling you what I hear and see and feel."
And
but
it wasn't. Yeah, exactly.
But they were instrumental in getting people interested in a record store, because you were able to read the notes on the back before you bought it. So, in a manner of speaking, they were blurbs, but they didn't blurb out at you.
Let's go back.
The ones I wrote, I thought I wasn't saying the world's greatest, alto sax player, and in that hoopla kind of writing.
Well, that was what I was going to get to, because I remember reading some liner notes that were written for the saxophonist Eric Kloss, and I believe Bob Porter wrote them, and he basically said, "You know what? Eric has a 50-50 chance of making it." I mean, it was pretty. It was like the idea was there was no corporate interest in saying you need to build this up because we need to make money. This was about truth, and it was objective journalism, and it was being done on 10-inch vinyl, in some cases, and I love the feeling of the 10-inch. It almost reminds me of baseball cards. I know they're a little bit bigger,
Yeah.
but it just has this kind of it's a magic.
Your mother didn't throw them out when you went off to college. I had a fantastic baseball card collection, and I didn't figure that she was going to throw them out.
I wanted to go back. You said something earlier about, and it's so important for my audience, to hear about the scene growing up. We could always focus on Bird and Dizzy. I want to talk about Dizzy a lot, but I want you to talk for a moment about the accessibility, the amount of venues that were available to see jazz, the neighborhoods that cultivated live music. Could you break that down as a young man when you first got on the scene there and how magical it was?
Well, you've got to take this into account. My brother was 12 and a half years older than I was, and this is in the 30s, and he was going to the Savoy in Harlem and dancing, and he was going to clubs, and not so much clubs, but there used to be different buildings that were used. In Brooklyn, they had the Menorah Temple, and there would be two bands playing, pitted against each other, battle of the music.
Mm-hmm.
And he was because he was on these scenes, he was collecting the records of the people he liked. And I was 6, 7 years old when I got into it. I immediately loved the music. By the time I was 10, I could tell you the whole Count Basie trumpet section, trombone section, saxophone section, and the like. Because some of his favorite bands were Basie, Lunsford, Benny Goodman. Those were three of the favorites. But in going to the Savoy, you'll have to excuse my voice. I have to clear my throat.
No problem.
There were the bands at the Savoy that you wouldn't ordinarily pick up on, like Erskine Hawkins, the 20th Century Gabriel, and also the house band at the Savoy. The Savoy had two bandstands, one at either end of the dance floor, and the house band was Al Cooper and the Savoy Sultans,
mm-hmm.
which was 8 or 9-piece band, depending on if the guitar player was there. And as the saying goes, they could swing you into bad health. And so I heard the Savoy Sultans very early on and became one of my loves. And coming behind them was Louis Jordan, who was a very swinging alto player, more of a blues guy, but a very hot band. And there was a lot of different spokes on the wheel of jazz in those days. But the big bands really were the main focus.
And you could see them at, spiritual institutions. I have albums. This is from the '60s.
Not hearing you.
You could see a lot of this stuff. You could see a lot of music at different types of spiritual venues, at Jewish community centers or temples.
Well, the Menorah Temple was one. I don't know about other that kind, but mostly the dance halls. Roseland, and especially up in Harlem, the Apollo Theater would have great bands every week.
I wanted to ask you, when you were...
You're not coming through loud enough.
when you were frequenting clubs in the 40s and 50s, a lot of the bars were set up so that there was a peanut gallery for those who were underage and couldn't drink alcohol.
Yeah, well, that was only the Birdland and the club that preceded it, the Clique. And then that became a way of doing it. Those are larger clubs.
My point was that it offered an opportunity during intermission for guys like Dizzy to come over and talk to the younger kids. And in some ways, I mean, I had a story relayed to me by a guy who was in the scene at that time, who basically said Dizzy came over and invited him to come down to Central Park and play softball. So it was the accessibility to the artists that made them more human.
Definitely. I started out in the smaller clubs on 52nd Street, and the first night I saw Dizzy, he passed our table. I have a couple of friends of mine that love jazz that I was going to school with. We were sitting at a table, and I guess I was kind of forward in those days without being obnoxious. And Dizzy passed by, and I said, Dizzy, when are you going to record again? And he said, we recorded today. And that was the 52nd Street Jazz album, which had half a band led by Coleman Hawkins, all-star band, and Dizzy's group, which was a small band at that time.
I was going to ask you also, was it common to see athletes and entertainers and, in some cases, politicians frequent jazz clubs? I remember Pat Martino telling me a story. I believe Smoke, the club, was up in Harlem at one time, and it was owned by Wilt Chamberlain. And it seemed like there was an overlap of entertainers, politicians, and athletes that added credibility to this new form of jazz.
Well, on 52nd Street, I don't think it was that much. It was just people coming to listen to the jazz, and if there were athletes there, I wasn't aware of it. But it was true that many athletes, being of in their 20s, were jazz fans, because that was the music that was capturing the imagination of a lot of people, because we had a lot of DJs on the radio playing the music, and you got to know what time they were on and stay up late and listen to them. And there were the remotes from different clubs and ballrooms around the country, and they called them remotes. They broadcast kind of after 9:30, 10:30, where you could hear all the great bands. And radio played a big part.
Could you talk about, I think Ed Beach at the Riverside Church? He was pretty instrumental. He had a Sunday afternoon program, I believe.
Yeah, he was a very thorough and entertaining host. And but you're going to this is a later period. I'm talking about when it was first getting going on the radio. Martin Block had the Make Believe Ballroom, and he played the pop selections by the big bands and the vocals, but he always made time to have jazz sections in his programming.
We're talking with Ira Gitler, tremendous jazz writer and really a legend. Ira, I'm not going to sit here and say that my comfort zone is the time period that your formative years were in. As best you can talk about in your book, Jazz Masters of the 40s and Swing to bop. For the audience, can you talk about just the idea of the kind of jazz that when things were just first starting out and how things progressed from sort of the big band to eventually straight bop or bebop?
Yeah, well, I'm not going back to the pre-swing era, when jazz had its roots in, you can't leave out New Orleans.
Right.
And other big cities around the country were the hubs. But as I said, I started listening at that time when those big bands were very popular. And then when my brother went into the Navy during the World War II, I started buying the records for the collection. And all I can say is the music just hit me in my soul. I didn't have to ask myself, hey, do I like this? It just was a natural. And it progressed to the point where, as I said, I started buying the records. In those days, you could go into a record store and actually sit in a booth and listen to a selection of 78s before you decided to buy.
I just we're going to take a hard break here in about a minute and a half, but I have to ask you, Ira, please tell me who is going to flip the bill for moving the fences in at Citi Field. Is that going to be dumped on the taxpayers again?
Well, I don't think so. Maybe if they're not hit too hard with the Madoff.
Yeah, I was going to say, is the Bernie Madoff fund going to pick up that bill?
That prosecutor is having trouble prosecuting people, not just the Mets. And I would say the Mets are going to have to pay for it. Maybe with the money that they're not going to pay to the people trying to get the money out of them from the Madoff. That's such a, that Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, it was very diabolical. This is my primary source, archival tribute to my heroes in jazz and guys who promoted the music and, like Ira said, hit them right in their soul. Ira, hang tight. We're going to take a break, come back on the other side, and do a whole lot more. Okay, my friend?
Okay.
All right. This is the Jake Feinberg Show. Folks, this is Jake Feinberg. As a passionate consumer of vinyl records, I value the art of collecting and archiving. So I have marked my calendar for Sunday, November 6th for the 7th Annual Tucson Record Show, located at Las Casuaritas Event Center at I-10 and Grand. The show features vinyl collectors and dealers from all over the state. Doors open at 9 a.m. and tables are available for rent, but space is running out fast. For more information, contact Bruce Smith at 622-0104. The 7th Annual Tucson Record Show, 1365 West Grant and I-10, Sunday, November 7th. It's time to dig and get dirty. Don't miss it. Yeah, good. Folks, this is Jake Feinberg. When it came time to decide where to buy my daughter a piano last year, the choice was easy. We got it at Hackenberg & Sons Piano Company. Located at 4333 East Broadway Boulevard, Hackenberg & Sons is Tucson's longest-running family-owned piano business. Run by three brothers and a son, they pride themselves on superior instruments and customer satisfaction. It's why they've been around so long. And it's why their pianos are used at the University of Arizona, Pima Community College, and many other prestigious institutions. So whether it's for your child, business, or yourself, when you buy a piano, make sure you go to Hackenberg & Sons. It'll be the beginning of a long-lasting partnership. For more information, visit them at hackenbergpiano.com. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Be a part of a new coalition with Jake Feinberg. The second half of my show starts right now. Welcome back, everybody, to the Jake Feinberg Show. Joined today by a legend and historian, writer, author, and avid hockey player, Ira Gitler. Ira, welcome back.
Thank you, Jake.
You know,
I was reminded of a little funny story when I was in grade school. You know, you like to have passions. This is before jazz, and kids love cowboy movies, right? And playing cowboys and Indians, as we used to call it. Well, for some reason, I told some of the kids in the class that I was born in Tucson, Arizona. And one day when I was out of school, the teacher was taking, statistics on each child, and somebody who I had told this to said, "Oh, he was born in Tucson, Arizona." And when I got back to school the next day, the teacher asked me, "Where were you born?" And I said, "I was born in Brooklyn," and explained the Tucson story to her.
That's I love these connections, and I think that, I was talking to Tad Hirschhorn over at the Jazz Institute of Studies over at Rutgers, and he said that, not everything in jazz goes on the coasts, New York and California. The rest of the country is not just flyover country, and I'm very proud to be able to do this archive and to go on this mission that I'm on in Tucson, and eventually cultivate and bring back jazz. We can get into it in a little bit, but I wanted to put it in your mind, is the idea of trying to figure out how to cultivate jazz in towns that used to have great jazz scenes, not amazing jazz scenes like urban centers like Chicago or Houston or New York, but places like Tucson where people from Cal Jader's band rave about coming down here, used to come down here in the 70s and go to the Doubletree Hotel for a couple nights and go out for breakfast in the morning. I think it's interesting to talk about the cyclical effect of jazz, and I would like to get your opinion on that a little bit later. I have interviewed Richard Davis twice on my show, and he talked about living in New York in the 1950s and being the best double bass player, and he couldn't score a gig because nobody was going to give a black guy a chance to play. And I want to...
Well, that's kind of far-fetched. He had a lot of gigs.
Well, I think that
the prejudice was still there, and depending on what circle you were traveling in. But he also was a very all-around bass player. He could play the classics, and maybe he was talking about that.
He said that right,
classical musicians to break in.
He said that the only guys that would give him gigs were guys like Leonard Bernstein, and then the other guy who led the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra. But more to the point, can you talk to the audience about how the multiracial affect of jazz contributed to the breaking down of barriers as it related to the acceptance of black musicians?
Well, absolutely. If you love the music, and then you got to meet the people, and with myself, I didn't have any ideas about black people. I mean, we had a maid when I was growing up, and she left the job because she had to take care of her family in another way, and she would come back and visit with us. She was like a friend. We didn't look at her as hired help, you know. So I grew up looking at black people, as individuals, and my love of jazz just made that grow. And like when I was talking about 52nd Street, it was a little village of its own between 6th and 5th Avenues, with clubs on both sides of the street. And you started hanging out on the street, if your face became familiar, you would get friendly with the musicians. They were forthcoming, talk about music and anything else, but mostly music. And that was definitely a bridge for blacks and whites to get together, and it wasn't about what color you were. And the jazz fans had such a respect for the great players, or the sidemen, because the sidemen were good too. Everybody that got to play there had some kind of talent, and they also had an attitude towards life, which was something that drew you in to the whole scene. And so I got to meet a lot of musicians that way.
Can you articulate a little bit more about their attitude towards life?
Well, they lived to play. Yeah, sure, they were making money at it, and sometimes it wasn't a hell of a lot of money.
Right. No, definitely not.
But once what can I say? Inculcated by this music, once it gets a hold of you, it is music for the soul. It can make you feel better when you're not feeling so good.
Mm-hmm.
It can raise you up.
Mm-hmm.
And when you hear the blues played authentically, you can hear the person kind of crying out, and the blues were both happy blues and sad blues, but they all made your soul a lot better. It's a healing music.
Were you familiar with you had Weinstock doing Jazzland. Riverside was coming out at that time. Prestige in the 50s. Were you familiar with what the Weiss brothers and the work they were doing with fantasy?
Sure.
I.e. the legendary. I interviewed Larry Taylor, who ran the Jazz Workshop, still runs Scullers up there, and he talked about running a real sort of archaic microphone, dangling it over the stage, and he picked up Desmond and Brubeck doing Over the Rainbow and a few other tunes. And then he was in high school, and within a week or two, Fantasy called him and said, "We'd like to put that on a record, live from Storyville." I was wondering, if the kind of communication you had with, because it was really happening on both coasts. So I was just kind of wondering how you, the kind of stuff you picked up on and the relationship you had with those guys.
Well, I knew a lot of musicians when they were with Woody Herman's band. And that band broke up, and a lot of the people stayed in California. And so I knew a lot of musicians who were in California because I had met them already on the road or in New York. And when I was at the University of Missouri, I used to travel around a lot to Chicago and St. Louis and listen to all the music there. And I met Shorty Rogers when he was on Woody's band. We became friendly, and I just made a lot of friends just by, mixing with the musicians at intermission or whatever. And I wasn't bashful about it. And I had many great listening experiences going out with the guys after the gig was over, and they would then go someplace else to hear another band.
It seemed to me that there were also just the pedigree. I remember talking to Bobby Pierce, the great piano player, and he told me, he said, there was something about the generation that preceded ours. It just seemed to be stronger, whether it was, Philly Joe Jones, Elvin Jones, Charles Mingus. There are stories about, these guys were titans. They were incredible players, and yet, sometimes people would be in awe of approaching them. But like you said, you put yourself out there and you actually go up to them and they respect you for that, and then you really realize that they were just amazing human beings. There was really no ego involved.
But they had personality.
Right.
Too, because remember, it was show business in a way from the very beginning. Entertaining. But entertaining with great music. But a lot of the musicians had very strong personalities that got them over to people who may have come in to hear the music for the first time. The jazz musicians are a breed alone. There's a camaraderie, there's a brotherhood, and all the other things that can go in life. There's backbiting and stuff like that. But as a group, I found them to most of them had senses of humor and other interests. But jazz was their life. They took it seriously.
Can you talk a little bit about one guy that has been, as I say on the intro of my show, I feel very deeply that there are certain spirits inside of me that are pushing me forward and just getting a blast out of what I'm doing. And I was one guy who I really was never exposed to or listened to a lot, and I have listened to a lot now, is Dizzy Gillespie. And
he was an amazing man.
Yeah, talk about Dizzy's as his personality.
Who is still not rated as highly as he should be, and that's saying something.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the vital people, not just for his playing, but his conception. And he could sit down at the piano and write very interesting chord progressions. And it's been said very, very often, no matter what instrument you play, if you come through, you got to come through the piano. Got to know something about the keyboard. But Dizzy was a genius and a great personality, as you know.
I've interviewed. I actually wanted to. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, Ira, is that because I'm totally locked into the late '60s and early '70s period of jazz, and I know you started your hockey team in 1973, so you were still cranking at that point. And Dizzy's band at that time was made up of Mike Longo and Al Gaffa and Mickey Roker. Earl May on bass. And I just wanted you to talk for a minute about that period of time. There was so much going on. You had this transition from acoustic instrumentation to electric instrumentation. You had sort of this black awareness, this black power. Black power is the wrong word, but it was a consciousness movement on both coasts. And I really want you to talk about that period of time, what you remember most about jazz, because it was, to me, was really the last real vibrant opportunity where you could see jazz at these great clubs like Slugs, the amount of accessibility and just the great players that were out there. Take a moment and talk about that time period, if you would.
Well, there's still, you can go out every night in the week in New York and hear something different.
Right.
But that was, as you say, kind of the end of the heyday because little by little, starting with Bill Haley and the Comets, leading into the British groups, that started to kill off the jazz audience, because the young audience coming up, went rock crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And but jazz still had its fans, and I like to say that people had sharp ears, were still patronizing the jazz clubs. But if you remember, some groups, in order to kind of get in on the popularity and the money, were playing rock tunes and changing their overall repertoire.
Yeah, there was also, like, what I found really cool at that time, though, was that, like, you had guys like Airto and even Dizzy to a certain degree, other guys too, Ray Mantilla. There was this fusion of sort of Brazilian and Afro-Cuban music. So you were getting percussive instruments that were not normally associated with jazz.
Well, Dizzy was in on the real beginning of fusing Afro-Cuban music with jazz in the 40s.
Exactly.
But he had a background of playing with Latin bands and instrumentalists from South America, and so he had a jump on a lot of people.
I've been doing a lot of research about Cal Tjader and his innovative techniques as it relates to combining jazz and Latin idioms, and he was influenced by Tito Puente. In fact, Al McKibben, George Shearing's bass player and Cal Tjader's old bass player, used to take Cal to see Tito Puente and in that mambo scene.
Yeah.
When did you
very big in New York?
Yeah, talk about how you got hip to that music and your experiences in that, because it was just another layer of the multi-ethnic music that was going on at that time.
Yeah, but Dizzy was the one that brought me to it.
Oh.
Before that, you heard Xavier Cugat, but Dizzy was playing with these musicians before we knew about Dizzy Gillespie. And he took to it naturally. And his band recorded many of the Afro-Cuban kind of things. Manteca, for one, was a big hit. And but it was a natural thing with Dizzy. He came up as a musician by playing a lot of different jobs, not just jazz. And then there was Chico O'Farrell.
Mm-hmm.
He came from Cuba and is a brilliant arranger. He brought that element into recording. And of course, later he had his own big band, and now his son has carried on the tradition, Arturo O'Farrell. And he's got a wonderful band that you could classify as Afro-Cuban jazz and straight-ahead jazz and variations on these themes.
Yeah, Charlie Hayden is also doing a lot of good stuff too, in that sense. But in our remaining moments with Ira Gitler, I feel like I talked to him for hours. When you and Leonard Feather came together to co-write the Encyclopedia, what did you guys decide would be your role in the sections that you were going to take on, the strengths that you had?
Well, it started back with the first encyclopedia that Leonard did, which was, I guess, about 1954. I became like his intern. I had stopped working at Prestige, except for still doing liner notes, but I wasn't in the office. I had gone through a period of actually producing recordings when Bob Weinstock felt like he was getting the recording studio was too much for him. And later on in life, we found out that he was bipolar.
Wow.
And he'd have these, down periods.
Mm-hmm.
He said, and I had run a couple of sessions before that, but for about 2 years I did the recording. But anyway, here I was not with a weekly paycheck, just freelancing, doing liner notes, mostly for Prestige. But Leonard asked me if I would be his assistant on this first encyclopedia, and I wasn't paid, but he got me a lot of writing jobs. That's how I got started with Blue Note, because he was writing for Blue Note, and he couldn't do all the backs of the records that they were putting out, so he suggested me to do some of them, and Alfred Lyon of Blue Note liked the way I wrote, and so I started writing for Blue Note. But here I would come to Leonard's apartment. We both lived on the west side, and figured out how to get all the information, made up a questionnaire, sent it out to the musicians. I remember having to go down to Birdland to get a couple of people to fill out the forms. And Oscar Goodstein, who was the manager, said, "What do you mean? You can't get in for nothing." And Leonard spoke to him, and he said, "He's been coming here for a couple of years, and he pays to get in." And Leonard said, "But now he's working in a different category. He's doing the information, getting the information on the different musicians."
Ira, we gotta go. Thank you so much. We'll continue this conversation, my friend.
When will we continue it?
I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you, my friend.
All right. So we're done for the day?
Yeah, we're done. Take it easy. This is the Jake Feinberg Show.
Keep swinging.
Keep swinging. Did you hear that? That was awesome.
KJLL, South Tucson.